Today on Day of Discovery, In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon.
We know from the digging of the cisterns into the limestone strata that Bethlehem was originally an Israelite city.
It almost seems as though it's a city unto itself. It is so quiet, it's so beautifully situated. It's surrounded by picturesque beauty with all of these valleys. Hey friends, welcome. This is In His Footsteps with Day of Discovery. I'm Jim Cantelon. Guess where I am? I'm sitting right here looking over at Bethlehem. Bethlehem is right over my shoulder. This is an ancient city, the city of David, the city where Jesus was born. Coming up in this show, we're going to take a look at the history of Bethlehem. We're going to provide a context in which we can then follow up over the next few shows the story of Jesus' birth, and you're going to love it. Pam Saran is joining me. She is an Israeli guide. She'll be giving me some background, some input that I can't give you because of her expertise, and it's going to be a half hour well worth it. So you just hang in there with us, enjoy. I'll be back with more right after this. I'm sitting here on this ledge, minor cliff really, with Bethlehem right behind me. Yes, friends, that's Bethlehem. It is an ancient city. It has humongous history. It has such beautiful contours, such local color. Back when I was pastoring King of Kings in Jerusalem, Israel in the 80s, I used to bring my congregation out here every Christmas Eve to the Shepherd's Fields, and we would sing Christmas carols right here. It may be hard for you to see it as you're looking at me. We'll try to get a close-up a little later in the show, but those are terraces behind me. The fields were terraces, not big Saskatchewan-like or North Dakota-like fields of wheat, but they would terrace the hillsides, and so you'd have maybe 15 to 20, 30 feet of width. They'd plant grass, and then there's so many caves that are attached to those terraces that it was quite common for shepherds to keep their sheep in those caves, and at night they would put them in there, build a little fire, and keep watch over them to make sure that no thieves or wild animals came along to steal them. So this is where I am. You can see olive trees behind me. This one right here behind me, I think, is about 1,000 years old. So this is a land of history, and Bethlehem certainly is a city of history. Now, because Bethlehem is so important, we're going to be doing 3 Bible teachings, 3 separate shows on the Advent, the coming of the baby, Jesus Christ, God made flesh, being born right here in Bethlehem. But I want to get right back to some of the early history of Bethlehem, just for context, so you can understand and appreciate what we're dealing with here. And one of the earliest references to Bethlehem, as far as the prophets are concerned, is Micah. Now, Micah in chapter 5, verse 2 says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting. Therefore he shall give them up until the time that she who is in labor has given birth. Then the remnant of his brethren shall return to the children of Israel, and he shall stand and feed his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they shall abide. For now he shall be great to the ends of the earth. This one shall be peace." Wow, what a passage. You need to underline that one yourself. Micah chapter 5, verses 2 to 5. First of all, Bethlehem Ephratah. What's that all about? Well, in the ancient language, Ephratah means twice blessed. Twice blessed. Now, how would Bethlehem be twice blessed? Well, there's one speculation. It was the home of David, who became king of Israel, the one to whom God promised an everlasting kingdom. So in that sense, this little town bears the greatest leader in all of Israel's history. Very blessed. But then there's more. Along comes Jesus, who's of the line of David, but is the Savior not just of Israel, but of the entire world. He is God made flesh, dwelling among us, full of grace and truth. Frankly, when I see Ephrata, that's what I think of. Now, you might have your own interpretive approach to this, but boy, I see Bethlehem twice blessed in King David and in Jesus. Though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth the one to be ruler, capital R, in Israel, referring to Messiah, whose goings forth are from of old, from everlasting. You can't say everlasting about David, but you can say everlasting about Jesus, right? So I wanted you to be aware of that ancient prophetic word about Bethlehem. But there's more here. Do you remember the story of Ruth? Let me turn to Ruth. It's a short little book in the Old Testament, as you know. I'll just read a few verses here. Verse 1 of chapter 1 of Ruth. It came to pass in the days when the judges ruled that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, which means God is my king. The name of his wife was Naomi, and the names of his two sons were Machlon and Chilion, Ephrathites of Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to the country of Moab and remained there. Now, you know how that story sets up. They go to Moab because there's a famine here. Moab is just, as a crow flies, maybe 30 miles from here, east and south. While they're there, Elimelech's sons marry, and they both die. Elimelech dies and the two sons die, leaving Naomi a widow and Ruth and Orpah widows. And you know the story, how the famine ends and Naomi wants to come back to her ancestral home, be with her family, extended family members. And only Ruth says, no, if you go, I go with you. Whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people will be my people. Your God, my God. That's the famous quote from Ruth. But Bethlehem became not only the adopted home of Ruth the Moabite. Remember that. Ruth is a Moabite, not an Israelite. But she ends up marrying an extended family member of Naomi's, who's a very well-to-do farmer and sheep herder here, and his name is Boaz. Well, you know how that happens. They get married and they have a child, and when you know it, they become ancestors of King David, right here, right? So Ruth is a part of the history of Bethlehem. And then when young David is born to his father Jesse, he's born here in Bethlehem. So when the scripture refers to Bethlehem as the city of David, that's exactly what they mean. Now, it wasn't the city of David because he was born there. It became the city of David because he became the king of Israel. But they would trace back to where he was born, and suddenly Bethlehem got this honorific, this special name because of who was born here. So this is a city that is right on the edge of Jerusalem. To get here, actually you could walk in a few hours, but it's maybe 3-4 miles, 5 miles. It almost seems as though it's a city unto itself. It is so quiet, it's so beautifully situated. It's surrounded by picturesque beauty with all of these valleys. And you can't see it from here, but over on the far southeast side, it actually breaks into some flatter land and some fields, but those were not the shepherd's fields. These were the shepherd's fields. But when we talk about Bethlehem now, over the next couple of shows, when we get into a bit more of the history of Bethlehem and then into the story of the Advent, I'm hoping that these few short minutes, just kind of giving you the setting historically, will help make it a 3D experience when we get to that part of it, okay? Joining me in a few minutes is Pam Saran. She is a very trusted Israeli guide, and she's going to give us far more background and history of this marvelous city, Bethlehem, the city of David.
And now we return to In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon on Day of Discovery.
So friends, for all the interviews for this series, I moved to Jerusalem, and I'm right about 200 or 300 meters from the Western Wall. Behind me, this is Bar Mitzvah Day. You hear the celebration surrounding young men being Bar Mitzvahed. So it's a very alive place. Don't let the music distract you. This is just a part of the atmosphere here. Pam Saran is joining me. I've mentioned that Pam is a very trusted guide. I just found out recently retired, Pam, after what, 20 years?
Yeah.
And happily retired or not happily retired?
Well, when a guide says that they're retired, it means that they're hanging loose. They could go out and guide, or they don't have
So
to.
you still retain your license?
Of course.
Oh,
Yes.
good. Well, you're speaking to a lot of people here, and I'm looking forward to your input. Let's talk about Bethlehem. Before we get into Jesus' birth and future programs, Bethlehem, the city of David. Give us a kind of a little snapshot history of Bethlehem.
Well, to begin with, we find out just through looking at the topography that Bethlehem is without a natural water source, and that means that it was not settled by Canaanites beforehand. It was basically begun in the Israelite period by Israelites that came into the mountains, and they had the technology to dig cisterns, and that was their water source. And so we know from the digging of the cisterns into the limestone strata that Bethlehem was originally an Israelite city.
So with cisterns, they were relying on rainwater.
That's right. And the Israelis, or the Israelites, had the technology to do this, because if you read in Joshua 17, it talks about some of the tribes, the tribe of Manasseh, having to settle in the mountains and not in the valleys, where there are the Canaanites with their chariots of iron.
Right. The mountains would be a more secure place for them, right?
More secure, harder to prepare for agriculture, but ultimately very good for agriculture.
Huh. Why is that?
Well, Bethlehem sits on a ridge of limestone strata. And when the rain comes down, it dissolves this limestone, and you get this beautiful terra rosa earth, this red earth. Mm-hmm. And if you clear the strata, because they're kind of in steps, if you clear that strata and kind of build it up, which is the typical farming method that we see in Nazareth, right. You will discover that trees like olive trees and grapevines, and then of course the wheat and the barley, all those things grow really well in this terrace kind of farming.
You know, that was one of the things that really struck me the first time I was in Bethlehem, Pam, was the terraces.
Yes.
You know, it never occurred to me that shepherds' fields would be terraces.
Right. Well, now here we have to qualify that, because the shepherds' fields of today is more like a site where we gather. Right. But sheep and goats, the shepherds were not allowed to come into the fields. They had to stay east of town, right, where you have the more smooth rolling hills, right, of the chalk hills, and that's where the grass grew, and they were not allowed to bring their sheep and goats in because they would ruin all the crops.
Well, there you go. I just learned something about that.
Yeah.
So, Pam, how did Bethlehem become known as the city of David?
Well, he was born there.
Right.
That's where he grew up. And that's where he became a shepherd. And David was a shepherd, and he shepherded his sheep out there east of town all the way down to En-Gedi.
So it wasn't originally the city of David, but when he became famous, they said this is where he was born, now it's his city.
Right, and of course his relatives, Ruth and Boaz, this is, you know, the line of the family is in Bethlehem, Boaz being a member of one of the patriarchal families of Bethlehem, and Ruth being the Moabitess, coming from Moab and marrying into that family, and then she becomes an ancestor.
Now, when the book of Ruth says that Bethlehem was going through a famine, I suppose this would be related to the cycles of weather,
yes,
drought?
obviously it was a drought, and the water that was collected was not enough to grow the wheat and the barley. And so a lot of people migrated over to the steppes of the plains of Moab, which are directly opposite.
Yeah, it's not that far really, is it?
Right, except one thing, and this is curious, the Dead Sea is in between Bethlehem and Moab. But if you just head north from Bethlehem, then you go down the valley, passing by the northern part of the Dead Sea, then you would come up on the other side and you would arrive in Moab.
And you would think that with a drought in Bethlehem, there'd be a drought in Moab as well, but not necessarily so.
Not necessarily, because the clouds, it's interesting how the weather patterns are. And the clouds are coming off the Mediterranean, bringing the moisture, and they get to the place right where Bethlehem is. This is a watershed line. And usually they drop a lot of rain. Bethlehem gets a lot of rain, and also north of Bethlehem. But what happens is the Dead Sea is evaporating all the time, and that evaporation kind of breaks up the clouds, and then they reform on the other side. And so you have this very rich and fertile land, flatlands, where wheat and barley were grown, and it was very, very rich, fertile soil.
So Naomi and her husband, what was it, Machlon? How do you spell it? Pronounce his name? Not Machlon. What was it? I can't remember. Anyway, maybe you find it while I comment. She and her husband and 2 sons, right? They go over to Moab to escape this drought, and they must have been there for quite a while, because the sons marry. And one of them marries Ruth.
Right.
And one of them marries Orpah, was it?
Yes.
And then everybody dies.
Yeah, it's terrible.
I mean, except for Naomi and
Elimelech.
Elimelech, that's it.
Elimelech was the name of the husband.
Yeah, you know, I've been doing these studies my eyes are spinning. Okay, so Elimelech, which means what? God is my king?
Something like that,
like that, yeah.
Eli, God, my God, and King, Melech.
King, my God, King, yeah. So everybody knows the story of how Ruth said to Naomi, if you're going back, I'm going with you. Whither thou goest, I will go. Whither thou lodgest, I will lodge. That's been quoted at more weddings than you can count. But this was quite a thing for a Moabite woman to basically cross culture and go into a foreign country.
Yes, I mean, first of all, the Moabites were very attached to their gods. If you read some of the accounts where David is fighting Moab and so forth, and there's this one king named Mesha who actually inscribed a stone called the Moabite stone, the Mesha stone. There's this god that they were all attached to, and they thought everything happened because of this god of Chemosh.
That was the fire god, right? Did you give your firstborn child to this fire god?
I'm not sure. I can't really get into the god, but they were very strong on him, and they would fight, to take territory for this god. And so for a woman to suddenly turn her back on her people and family relatives and her customs and the familiar surroundings and follow her mother-in-law, Le'an Shehu, wherever, and having no idea where if they were going to make it to Bethlehem, that's quite a step of faith.
It's a phenomenal story. Plus, she knew with Naomi, she was going with a widow. Her chances of food security were almost nil.
That's
right. It was almost like guaranteed poverty.
Yeah.
But they get to Bethlehem, and what happens?
Well, they get into town, and then Naomi, she knows the whole setup, how to do things, the protocol in the Bethlehem families. Yeah. And she advises her daughter-in-law what to do, and it's all about the barley harvest.
Right.
It's harvest time, and so she says, you go out into my cousin's field. Boaz was, I think, a cousin.
Yeah.
Go out into my cousin's field, and you glean there.
Yeah.
And she worked very hard, and she won favor because he saw how hard she worked, and so he gave her a little bit more honor. And then Naomi advised on how to get closer to him so that there would be this chance
Now there was this
for marrying.
kinsman redeemer concept.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And Boaz was sort of second in line to be Naomi's kinsman redeemer. There was someone else
Yes.
who refused to do it,
Yes.
and so the responsibility passed to Boaz.
Right.
Good man that he was, he took it on
Yes.
and married Ruth.
Yes. And I think he probably liked her by this time because
Yeah.
he saw how hard she worked
Yeah.
and he thought, wow, this is a great asset.
But quite
You
a
know?
thing for him
Yeah.
to marry a Moabite.
Very much so.
I mean, what a, you wonder what in the world is going on there. As I've read it, I've sometimes wondered if somehow the Lord wasn't speaking to him silently in a dream or two, because it was a huge leap for him.
Right. It could have been something like Joseph and
Yeah,
Mary.
yeah.
A little bit.
There's no
like
account
that.
of that, but
Yeah.
I mean, how do you explain a guy marrying someone who, in his cultural setting and his religious setting, is a pagan, a heathen?
Right. Yeah.
Um,
And then it was frightening because you have to remember when the Israelites were coming on their 40-year trek, they had a big run-in with Moab, and there was the problem with the women of Moab getting involved with the Israelite men and dragging them into idolatry. So there was that fear in the back, the history in the back of their minds.
You know what I find really cool is
Yeah.
when you read the genealogy of Jesus in Matthew chapter 1.
Yeah,
Ruth is in there.
that's right.
One of
Oh,
the
that's-
mothers of Messiah
Yeah,
was a Moabite.
isn't that amazing?
Totally amazing. When we got about 2 minutes left, Pam, on this segment. Fortunately, I have you for many other segments. I can hardly wait. But what is it about Bethlehem that gets you the most? Like, is there something about it that you like the most, or something that surprises you the most, or that you enjoy the most? Anything about it?
Well, I love the place. Essentially, I've been out there a lot,
Yeah.
and I love the. First of all, I love the topography. I love olive trees.
Right.
I'm crazy about olive trees,
yeah.
and they're all over the place. And of course, that's part of the name of Bethlehem is Bethlehem. That's the house of bread, or the house of fruitfulness.
Right.
And so I love the olive trees. I've painted out there. I have landscapes that I've done in Bethlehem.
And beautiful art it is. Now, we're not promoting your art on this show, but boy, I'll tell you, anything about Pam Saran. Micah, we got a minute. Micah called
Yes.
Bethlehem Ephrata, which I think means twice blessed.
Ephrata is actually fruitful.
Fruitful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Horerut.
Right.
Yeah.
But it produced not only King David,
Yes.
but also King Jesus.
That's right.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I've got my Micah scripture here
Yeah.
somewhere. It's in Micah 5.
Right.
And oh, Bethlehem Ephrata.
Yeah, Ephrata, yeah. Okay, we got 30 seconds. You find it.
Okay,
and- oh, you
but
got
you,
it.
Bethlehem Ephrata, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting.
Well, there you go. And that's the
There we
prophet
go,
Micah
yes.
speaking. I'll tell you, that's amazing. We're going to hear a lot more from Pam Saran as we talk about Jesus' birth, more about Bethlehem. Back to the close right after this.
And now we return to In His Footsteps with Jim Cantelon on Day of Discovery.
You know what strikes me as I sit here looking at Bethlehem, the home of David and the birthplace of Jesus? Everybody has a history. Everybody. You have one, so do I. Every one of us has a birthplace. Every one of us has some place we call home. Now, for some whose parents may have died, or whose parents have split up, or you have been raised in social services and you've gone from home to home in a foster parent situation, it's more difficult for you to relate to what I'm talking about here. And if you are one of those, I want to comfort you with this knowledge. Ultimately, the scripture teaches us that this world is not our home. There's an old gospel hymn that used to say, "This world is not my home, I'm just a passing through." We're all transient. And ultimately, friends, our home is with the Lord in heaven. And a lot of the, discomfort, a lot of the insecurity, a lot of the uncertainty that sometimes plagues our lives relates to the fact that we are pilgrims. None of us are fully content, even though we may have a home city, even though we may have a birthplace. There's something in us that says we don't belong here. We belong somewhere else. Think of faith that way. Think of your relationship with Jesus that way. Yes, he's done a lot for you in space and time. He is your comfort, he is your friend, but he's leading you home. And however dislocated you may feel, depending on your upbringing, you need to know that the day comes on the other side when you will live in perfect peace. I'm Jim Cantelon. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Join us again next week at this same time for another Day of Discovery. Day of Discovery is a video outreach of Our Daily Bread Ministries Canada and is supported by the free will gifts of friends like you who enjoy these programs. For more information about Our Daily Bread Ministries Canada, please visit us online at ourdailybread.ca.